Let's get a divorce now. I know about you and your boss. The coffee cup stopped in midair, her eyes instantly froze. Her breath caught in her throat, and the silence between us seemed to scream louder than any words could. She tried to laugh, as if I'd just told a bad joke, but all that came out was a choking sound, a desperate attempt to maintain control. I saw the tremor in her fingers as she placed the cup back on the table, and for a brief second, I could see the fear dance in her gaze. What are you talking about? Her voice broke, but she tried to sound firm. I could have stopped there. He could have allowed her to maintain the illusion of innocence for a few more minutes. But no. I had already watched too much, waited too much, pretended too much. Each night she got off work later. Every message I insisted on deleting. Every lame excuse I forced myself to believe. Everything converged at that moment. I know everything. The words came out sharper than I expected. I know about the hidden lunches. I know about meetings in cheap hotels. I know the lies you told every time you walked out the door pretending you still loved me. She turned pale. There was no way to escape. You're crazy, he muttered. You're making things up in your head. I saw you. Together. In the parking lot, in his car. I saw how he touched your face. I saw how you smiled at him, the same smile that used to be mine. She stood up, knocking over her chair in the process. I can explain, he whispered, as if there were any possible explanation. But I didn't want explanations. I didn't want any more excuses. I wanted the truth, naked and raw, the way I had discovered it. I wanted her to feel the same chill down my spine that I felt when I saw everything with my own eyes. I loved you. I trusted you. And you threw it all in the trash. Why? Her silence was more deafening than any response could be. It was there, at that moment, that the mask finally fell. She didn't cry, she didn't beg. Instead, her expression changed. First, shame. Then something darker. I realized at that moment that she didn't really regret it. She only regretted getting caught. You always treated me as if I were invisible. The words came out sharp as knives. As if I were just part of the furniture in this house. Do you want to know why? Because I needed to feel alive again. And he made me feel that. Hearing this was like being punched in the stomach. She didn't even try to lie anymore. She just threw everything in my face, like she was tired of pretending. And you? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Does he mean something to you too? Or did you just need an escape valve? She hesitated. For a moment, I thought he was going to tell the truth. But instead he looked away. I don't know. Don't you know? My voice echoed in the kitchen. You destroyed our marriage for something you don't even know what it is. She ran her hands through her hair, frustrated. I didn't plan this. I didn't want to hurt you. But it hurt. I looked at her. And the worst thing is that he didn't even have the courage to tell me. He preferred to continue living this lie. I pushed away from the table, feeling adrenaline pumping through every fiber of my body. He finished. I want you out of this house today. Her eyes widened. What? I'm not going to sit here and pretend we can fix this. Not after what you did. You can't do that. This house is mine too. Not for long. She followed me into the hallway. Please. We can solve this. I made a mistake, but I still love you. I turned around, finally facing her with all the coolness I could muster. You don't love anyone but yourself. She stood there, still, not knowing what to do. For the first time, I saw real despair on his face. But I wasn't moved. I'm going to look for a lawyer. And you should do the same. I walked up the stairs without looking back, leaving her alone in the kitchen, with breakfast crumbs scattered across the table, a perfect setting for the end of a marriage. But as I packed my bags, something bothered me. There was a part of this story that didn't make sense. Something that was still hidden between the lines. I knew there was more. More than she was willing to admit. More than I was prepared to discover. And I would find out. Even if it cost everything. Welcome to the channel where secrets come to light and hidden truths are revealed. Here, we never support or romanticize betrayal. Our fictional stories show how infidelity corrodes relationships, destroys lives and leaves deep scars. Get ready to dive into an intense plot full of twists and turns. Take a deep breath, you are about to hear a shocking story that will remain etched in your memory. Happy listening. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the kitchen as David absent-mindedly twirled the spoon in the cup. Sunlight filtered through the white curtains, casting a soft glow on the table set with toast, fruit, and a nearly empty jar of jam. He liked that morning routine. I liked to wake up early, make breakfast, and have the table ready before Emily came downstairs. It made him feel present, as if small gestures could make up for the hours he spent in the office. She always said she loved his details, the way he remembered to cut the apples the way she liked or leave the newspaper folded next to the plate. David believed that these little things kept their marriage in balance, even after so many years together. Emily appeared at the kitchen door with her hair down and her eyes still a little sleepy. She was wearing that gray robe he had bought for their wedding anniversary 2 years ago. A simple gift, but one that she insisted on using every morning. David smiled when he saw her and pulled out the chair for her to sit down. She returned the smile, but she looked tired, as if the previous night hadn't been enough to rest. David sat next to her and buttered some toast while he talked about work, the meeting he had that afternoon and the deadlines that were pressing. Emily nodded, but her eyes wandered around the kitchen as if she were somewhere else. He noticed, but ignored it. Lately, she had been distracted. She commented little, avoided long conversations and, at times, seemed irritated for no reason. David tried to justify it as stress. After all, she also had her responsibilities. I was an administrative assistant at a renowned company and often took work home. He understood, or at least he tried. Emily put down her coffee cup and looked at him. He said he had an important meeting at the end of the day and might need to stay late at the office. David frowned, but then nodded in agreement. He had already gotten used to her schedule. He didn't like it, but he trusted it. I needed to trust. Emily has always been organized, dedicated to work and family. David knew this from the moment he met her. She was methodical, a perfectionist and had that aura of efficiency that fascinated him. The two met at a corporate event 7 years ago. He, recently promoted to financial manager, and she, a discreet assistant who attracted attention with her impeccable posture and easy smile. David fell in love quickly. Emily, more cautious, took time to open up, but when she gave in, it was completely. They had a rare harmony, the kind that seems destined to last forever. They got married 2 years later, bought a spacious house on the outskirts of the city and began planning a future. At first, the marriage was light. Candlelit dinners, spontaneous trips and plans for a family that never came. They tried for years, but Emily couldn't get pregnant. Medical appointments, treatments, and dashed hopes began to take a toll. David handled the situation practically, saying their love was enough. Emily, however, felt the impact deeper. She became more reserved, more focused on work and less present at home. David noticed the changes, but avoided confronting them. I was afraid of forcing a conversation that could open old wounds. Instead, he tried to compensate with gifts and kind gestures. I made surprises, organized romantic dinners and sent messages throughout the day. Emily thanked her, smiled, but the sparkle in her eyes was no longer the same. Still, he believed their marriage was safe. The silent nights on the couch, watching movies, and shared breakfasts gave the feeling that, despite everything, they remained connected. David saw her efforts and chose to ignore the moments when Emily seemed distant. He wanted to believe that this was just a phase. That morning, while Emily finished her coffee and got up to get ready, David watched her for a few seconds. She was still beautiful. Her brown hair fell softly over her shoulders, and her green eyes, although tired, were still the same ones that made him fall in love. But there was something about her that he couldn't decipher. A weight on your shoulders, perhaps. A hesitation in every movement. She left the kitchen, leaving a faint scent of perfume in the air. David stood there, alone, trying to ignore the tightness in his chest. It was just stress, he told himself. Just stress and tiredness. While washing the cups, Emily's cell phone vibrated on the table. David looked at the screen and saw a message from an unknown number. The impulse was immediate. He picked up the device, but the screen lock prevented him from seeing the content. He felt a pang of guilt for even thinking about looking, but that nagging feeling refused to go away. The day dragged by for David. At the office, he could barely concentrate. Emily's words echoed in his head. Important meeting. I'll stay later. He tried to push the thoughts away, tried to convince himself that everything was okay. But deep down, something in him knew he wasn't. When he arrived home, he found the living room empty. Emily still hadn't returned. He prepared dinner, opened a bottle of wine and waited. Minutes turned into hours. When he finally heard the door open, it was already past 10 at night. Emily came in with her hair a little messy and her eyes wide when she saw him sitting at the table. She smiled nervously, apologized for being late and said the meeting had run long. David nodded, trying to hide his discomfort. He asked how her day had been and received vague answers. He tried to hug her, but he felt her subtly move away. That night, while Emily slept next to him, David lay awake staring at the ceiling. He loved that woman. I loved more than I could explain. But something was wrong. He felt it. And, at that moment, he decided that he needed to know the truth. David woke up before sunrise, as usual. The bed next to him was cold and empty. Emily had already left for work or maybe just slept in the guest room again, as had been the case for the past few weeks. He didn't ask the reason for the nights apart. He chose to ignore it, as he did with most things lately. He stood up in silence, preparing coffee and looking at the chair where she usually sat. The marks of time on the edges of the wood seemed more visible that morning, and he wondered if the wear was just there or inside them as well. Emily was different, that was a fact, but he insisted on blaming it on work, tiredness or any other explanation that was easier to accept than the possibility that, deep down, was already haunting his mind. He went to his office and tried to concentrate, but the words on the computer seemed jumbled. Colleagues talked about projects, deadlines and meetings, but David's mind wandered. He remembered the perfume he smelled on Emily the night before. It wasn't the same one she used to wear. It was sweeter, more striking. Little details like this started to add up, and he realized he was starting to put together pieces of a puzzle he didn't want to put together. At lunchtime, he felt the urge to call her. He picked up the phone and hesitated. He thought about what he would say. Would you ask if she was okay? If I still loved him? Was he hiding something? But he gave up. I knew that if I asked these questions, I wouldn't be prepared for the answers. He preferred to send a simple message, asking about the day. She took a while to respond. When he finally responded, it was brief, almost cold. She said she was busy and would talk later. David dropped the phone on the table and felt his chest tighten. On the way back home, he passed by the building where Emily worked. The light in her office was off, but the clock only showed 6 o'clock. It was early for her to be out already, especially on a meeting night. He stood in the car, watching the entrance. People left in a hurry, some alone, others with others. Then he saw it. Emily walked through the glass door with quick steps. I wasn't alone. The man next to her was tall, well-dressed, and they seemed too close to be just colleagues. David couldn't look away. He saw them get into his car and disappear down the street. Back home, David sat on the couch with the lights off. I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it was a colleague, maybe they were discussing something about work, maybe he was exaggerating. But the way she smiled as she opened the car door, the way she leaned closer to him as she spoke, made all those excuses fall apart. That night, Emily arrived late again. She had the same nervous smile on her face as always and avoided his gaze. David tried to talk, asked how the day was, but she gave short answers and went straight to the shower. As the water ran, he picked up her cell phone from the table and this time, he didn't hesitate. The password was the same. He opened the messages and, within seconds, his world fell apart. The texts were direct. There were photos, intimate conversations, and date plans that made it clear what was going on. His name appeared several times. The boss. The one that David had already heard about a few times, always in a casual tone. When Emily came out of the shower, she found David sitting at the table, holding his cell phone. She stopped at the door, her face instantly turning pale. He looked up and, for the first time, saw guilt in her eyes. He didn't try to disguise it, he didn't make excuses. She just stood there, paralyzed. David threw the phone on the table and asked how long this had been happening. His voice was calmer than he expected, but his heart was hammering in his chest. Emily hesitated, and her silence was the confirmation he needed. When he finally opened his mouth, he said it wasn't what he was thinking, but the words sounded empty. He interrupted her. He said he had seen the messages, the photos, the scheduled meetings. She swallowed hard and lowered her head. He wanted to scream, but he couldn't. He wanted to break something, but he remained seated. He asked if she still loved him, and Emily took a while to respond. He said yes, but David didn't believe it. He asked her to explain why she had done that, and she remained silent for so long that he almost gave up waiting for an answer. When she finally spoke, she said she felt lost, that she needed to feel wanted, that she thought David didn't see her anymore. But he saw it. Always saw it. I just didn't know that, even seeing it, it wasn't enough. She cried. He apologized. He said it was a mistake, that he wanted to fix everything. But David didn't know if there was anything to fix. He felt betrayed, humiliated, and part of him wanted to send her away right then. But there was something in her gaze, something he couldn't decipher, that made him hesitate. Emily said it wasn't just her fault. That they had grown apart, that he was always busy, that conversations between them had become shallow. David listened, but her words sounded like weak excuses. He knew he could have done more, but he also knew that nothing justified what she did. He slept on the couch that night. Or at least tried. His head spun, and his stomach dropped every time he thought about the messages. He remembered the laughs, the touches and the smiles he had already seen between the two of them. I felt angry, but I also felt pain. Over the next few days, he avoided Emily as much as he could. She tried to talk, but he didn't want to listen. I needed time to process everything. She looked at her cell phone and thought about sending messages to the man, but decided against it. He felt ridiculous for even considering it. So he started investigating. She looked for his profile on social media, discovered the position and read everything she could find. The more I discovered, the angrier I felt. The man was successful, charismatic, and seemed to have everything under control. David wondered how someone like that could be interested in Emily, but then he hated himself for thinking that way. At the end of that week, David decided he needed answers. I needed to know where this was going. And when he finally confronted Emily for real, something in her expression changed. Fear appeared in her eyes, and David realized there was more. Much more. Something she hadn't told him yet. And he was determined to find out. David stood in the hallway, staring at Emily as if he were a stranger. She was sitting on the couch, her eyes fixed on the floor, and the silence between them felt so heavy it was suffocating. He expected answers, but all he got were blanks. He felt his chest tighten and anger rise in his throat, but he took a deep breath. I couldn't lose control. Not now. Emily looked up and tried to say something, but the words stuck. He crossed his arms and waited, feeling his stomach drop as he fought the urge to scream. She looked away, and David knew in that instant that the worst hadn't yet been revealed. He speaks. I want the truth. Now. Emily ran her hands through her hair, pulling at the strands as if that could relieve the tension. He tried to start, but his voice broke. She got up, walked to the window and turned her back to him. David felt his impatience growing, but he held firm. She turned around slowly, her face pale and her eyes watery. It's not just what you saw. There's more. David took a step closer, his heart racing in his chest. What else? You lied to me for months. Deceived me. Betrayed me. Now does that mean there's anything worse than that? She hesitated, biting her lower lip, and David felt his blood run cold. Emily lowered her head, took a deep breath and finally released the words that seemed to burn her throat. The money. David frowned, not understanding. What money? She raised her eyes slowly, and the desperation in them hit him like a punch. The company's money. For a moment, David couldn't process it. He blinked, waiting for her to continue, but all he received was silence. What did you do? Emily closed her eyes and let the tears fall. I helped him. I helped him embezzle money. He was the one who started it, but I knew and I kept quiet. Then I started to make it easier for him. We created false reports, approved transactions that didn't exist. I didn't know at first how far this would go, but... David felt the floor disappear. Did you steal? She shook her head no, but her words seemed empty. I didn't catch anything. But I knew what he was doing and I didn't stop him. I was afraid. He threatened me, said that if I said anything, he would blame me for everything. David took a step back, as if he needed space to process. This is serious. Do you understand this? You could be arrested. Him too. You too. She started crying harder, trying to get closer, but David backed away. I did it out of fear. But then everything got out of control. I thought I could stop, but he kept pushing me. And when we started, when I got involved with him, I knew there was no going back. David felt a lump in his throat. The betrayal had already been devastating, but this? The woman with whom he had shared years of life was involved in a crime. And more than that, he had allowed someone to manipulate and destroy his trust in every way possible. You destroyed everything. Emily dropped to her knees, grabbing the hem of his shirt. I'll fix it. I will surrender if necessary. But please don't abandon me. I still love you. He pulled her arms free and looked at her with contempt. You don't know what love is. She lay there, lying there, while David walked to the door. I needed air. I needed to think. Her words echoed in his head, mixing with the images of what he had seen and read. Anger mixed with pain made him want to scream, but he just walked away, leaving her alone in the room. He drove aimlessly for almost an hour. He felt his hands shaking on the steering wheel and stopped at the side of the road. He tried to breathe, but the feeling of suffocation increased. He picked up the phone and dialed the number of an old friend, a lawyer he hadn't seen in years. I needed help. When he returned home, he found Emily sitting on the floor, hugging her knees. She looked up and seemed surprised that he had returned. David threw a paper on the table. That's a lawyer. You will need one. She opened her mouth to respond, but he cut her off. I'm going to get out of here. I'll be gone for a few days. When I get back, I want you to have sorted out what you need. Because I won't carry this guilt with you. Emily got up and tried to reach him, but David moved away. I trusted you. More than anyone. And you destroyed everything. She tried to speak, but he left before she could finish. In the car, David felt the tears flow. Not for her, but for everything they had lost. For the years wasted, for the promises broken. He felt anger, pain and, above all, an emptiness that seemed impossible to fill. But as he drove away, something inside him began to change. I didn't know what I would do next. He didn't know how he would deal with what he discovered. I just knew that that story was far from over. David stopped the car in front of a small motel on the side of the road. The light rain beat against the windshield, creating an almost hypnotic rhythm. He turned off the engine but didn't leave. He stood there, staring at the drops of water running down the glass, while his mind went back over and over again to the last few hours. Emily kneeled, begging, her eyes filled with tears, and the confession that had changed everything. He pressed his hands on the steering wheel, trying to shake the image away, but it was still there. He entered the room, threw his suitcase on the floor and sat down on the bed with rough sheets. He picked up his cell phone and saw several missed calls. Emily had called 6 times. Her last message was short, "Please come home. We need to talk." David deleted it without responding. There was nothing more to talk about that night. He needed time. I needed to think. The next morning, he woke up to the sound of knocking on the door. He got up with his heart racing and opened it, expecting to find Emily. But it was my lawyer friend. I had asked to meet him early, and there he was. "We need to talk," said the friend, entering without waiting for an invitation. David nodded and closed the door. They sat at the tiny table in the room, and he told them everything. He didn't omit anything. She talked about the betrayal, the embezzlement of money, the threat from her boss and the despair in Emily's eyes. "This is more serious than you imagine," said the friend, after hearing everything. "If she really helped defraud the company, even without taking the money directly, she is involved. And if he's already threatened to blame her, it's probably because he left traces that incriminate her." David ran his hand over his face, feeling the weight increase. "What do I do? First, we need to know what this man has against her. He may have proof. There may be messages, documents signed by her. And if so, we need to act quickly. She needs a lawyer who specializes in this, because he will use her as a scapegoat as soon as he feels threatened." David shook his head. "What if she's lying? If I'm as guilty as he is? Then she will have to pay for this. But from what you described, it seems more like manipulation. And their personal involvement only complicates things." David got up and started pacing the room. "I don't know if I can look at her again. Not after all this. I understand. But you need to decide what you want. Do you want to save her or let her sink with him?" David looked at his friend, and something inside him stirred. As broken as he was, there was still a part of him that cared. "I didn't know if it was love or just the weight of years together, but I knew I couldn't leave her in that situation without at least trying to understand what really happened." Later, he returned home. Emily was sitting on the couch, holding her cell phone and looking at the screen as if expecting a miracle. When he saw David enter, he immediately got up, his eyes swollen from crying. "You're back." He stood at the door, not responding. She approached slowly, as if afraid he would run away at any moment. "I called you. I thought." David raised his hand to stop her. "I want to know everything. No half-truths. No excuses. All." She swallowed and nodded. "I've known about his scheme for months. He started by taking small amounts, things that no one would notice. But then the amounts increased, and he asked me to cover his tracks. He said that if I didn't do it, he would say that I was already involved and that everything would fall on me. I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. David crossed his arms. And you slept with him? Emily closed her eyes for a second before responding. I thought if I got close to him I could control him. But it was a mistake. I got carried away. It was only a few times, but I knew I was wrong. I knew I was losing you, but I was already so involved that I couldn't get out. David clenched his fists but kept his voice steady. And now? What does he have against you? Documents signed by me. Emails. He made me approve false reports. If this comes to light, I will be the first to be accused. David felt the weight of her words, but his mind was already racing. I needed to act quickly. Let's take everything he has against you. But you need to do exactly what I say. Over the next few days, David gathered information. It turned out that Emily's boss had a suspicious history at other companies and that he had manipulated other people in the past to cover up his crimes. He also discovered that the man was embezzling more money than they imagined and that he was close to fleeing the country. David and Emily came up with a plan. She would arrange a meeting with him to ask for help, pretending to be desperate. Meanwhile, David hired an investigator to collect evidence. On the scheduled night, Emily left nervously, but David assured her that they would be monitoring everything. He stayed in the car, outside the restaurant where the meeting would take place, watching every movement. When the man arrived, she smiled, but David saw the tremor in her hands. She handed over a flash drive saying that she had erased everything, as he asked. He smiled, but then tugged on her arm, saying he needed more reassurance. Emily tried to remain calm, but the fear was evident. From the car, David gripped the steering wheel, fighting the urge to invade the place. But then, the investigator, disguised as a waiter, approached the table and recorded the conversation. Every word, every threat made by man was recorded. When it was all over, Emily came out shaking and got into the car. David didn't say anything. He just drove to the house and gave the recordings to the lawyer. In the following days, the evidence was forwarded to the police, and her boss was arrested before he could leave the country. Emily had to give statements, but, with the recordings and his history of manipulation, she was able to prove that she had been coerced. Even so, nothing was the same again. David looked at her and saw the woman he loved, but he also saw the lies, the betrayal and the secrets. Emily tried to show regret, but he knew something had changed forever. On their last night together, he packed his bags while she watched in silence. I loved you. And maybe a part of me will always love. But I can't trust you anymore. Emily cried, but didn't try to stop him. When David left, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders, but the emptiness in his chest remained. He knew he still had a long way to go, but for the first time in months, he felt like he was in control of his life. David stood in the apartment's narrow hallway, staring at the open suitcase on the bed. The carefully folded clothes contrasted with the chaos he felt inside. The smell of Emily's perfume still hung in the air, clinging to the sheets and curtains, as if refusing to let it go. He ran his hands over his face, trying to shake off the thoughts that had haunted him since the moment he closed the door behind him. Every word spoken that night continued to echo, every tear of hers etched in memory as if she were watching a scene repeated countless times. The feeling of betrayal had not diminished, but the guilt seemed to increase every minute. In the mirror, he barely recognized himself. The tired face, the sunken, red eyes, the stubble, he didn't look like the same man who, a few weeks ago, believed he had control over his own life. The image of Emily asking for forgiveness, begging for another chance, kept coming back, like a wound he couldn't stop poking at. He wanted to hate her, he wanted to erase everything he felt, but he couldn't. There was still love. It destroyed him inside. He tried to focus on the present, on the next step. The meeting with the lawyer was scheduled, and he knew that the next decisions would be crucial. But what really haunted him was uncertainty. Emily had given herself completely, willing to bear the consequences of her own mistakes, and that affected him. Seeing the fear and pain in her eyes had been harder than any word said. He knew she wasn't innocent, but he also knew that the woman before him that night was not the same one who had betrayed his trust. She looked torn apart. Arriving at the lawyer's office, David sat in the leather chair and listened intently as the options were laid out on the table. The case was progressing against Emily's former boss, and the evidence collected was more than enough to secure a conviction. The lawyer explained that Emily would still need to give more statements and could be called as a witness in other related investigations. She was safe, at least for now, but the process would be long. David found himself asking himself if he really wanted to see her go through all this alone. As much as he tried to distance himself, there was a part of him that still wanted to protect her. This doubt followed him back to the empty apartment, where he threw himself on the sofa and stared at the ceiling, looking for answers that didn't come. That night, the cell phone vibrated on the table. It was Emily. He stared at the name on the screen for a few seconds before answering. Her voice was hesitant, almost broken. She said that she had received a summons for a new hearing and asked if he could accompany her. David closed his eyes, feeling the weight of that decision. Finally, he agreed. The next morning they met in court. Emily was pale, her hands shaking, holding a folder of documents. She tried to smile when she saw him, but David looked away. They walked together down the corridor, but the silence between them seemed to scream. During the hearing, David watched Emily answer questions with a wavering voice. She saw her nervousness grow as the defense lawyer tried to put her against the wall. She hesitated a few times, but stood her ground. When it was all over, he walked her to the exit without saying a word. Outside, Emily finally spoke. She said she understood if he didn't want to see her anymore, but thanked him for being there. David just nodded, fighting the urge to hold her and tell her everything would be okay. Instead, he turned and walked away. In the following days, he tried to distract himself with work and the responsibilities of the divorce, but nothing seemed to be enough to erase the memories. He spent hours remembering each moment, wondering if he could have done anything differently. He wondered if he should forgive her or move on. The anger he felt at first had turned into something more confusing, a mixture of compassion and resentment that left him paralyzed. When he finally received the divorce papers to sign, he stared at them for endless minutes. He picked up the pen, but his hands were shaking. He remembered the day they got married, the promises they made to each other and how they believed that nothing could separate them. But there he was, about to put an end to everything. The doorbell rang, breaking him out of his thoughts. He opened the door and found Emily there, holding a small box. She asked to enter, and David hesitated before making room for her to pass. She put the box on the table and said she wanted to return some of his things that she had found in the house. Books, old letters and a watch he had lost months ago. David looked at the box and then back at her, feeling his heart racing. Emily started to speak, but her voice trailed off. She said she was trying to move on, but she needed him to know how sorry she was. She said she still loved him, but that she understood that love was sometimes not enough. He asked for forgiveness once again, but this time he didn't wait for an answer. He just picked up his bag and walked to the door. David felt something tighten in his chest. He wanted to let her go, but the words came out before he could stop himself. Wait. She stopped, turned slowly, and looked at him with expectant eyes. David took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. I don't know what to do with all this. I don't know if I can forgive you, but I also don't know if I want to live with this doubt forever. Emily took a step towards him, but stopped when she saw the hesitation on his face. I just need to know that you're being honest right now. I don't want any more lies. She nodded, holding back tears. I promise. David stood still, feeling the weight of that promise. He knew that no matter what he decided, this would be his last chance. Emily knew this too. She left without saying anything else, leaving him alone again, but this time, David felt that something had changed. I didn't know if it was the final end or the beginning of something new, but I was ready to find out. David watched the paper in his hands, the divorce finalized, the signature marked in fresh ink. The weight of that decision seemed greater now that everything was officially over. He didn't feel relief, as he imagined he would. The void was still there, a dark hole that he didn't know how to fill. The memories still haunted him, but now they seemed more distant, as if they already belonged to another life. Emily had left the house the day after the papers were handed in, and they hadn't spoken to each other since. He wondered where she was, what she was doing, but he struggled not to feed that curiosity. The days became weeks, and David threw himself into work, trying to rebuild his life. But no matter how hard he tried to move on, something always pulled him back to those final moments with Emily. Her fragility, her tears, her desperation for a second chance. Part of him wanted to believe that she had changed, that the regret was real, but the other part knew that trusting again would be a risk he wasn't willing to take. He received the news of Emily's former boss's conviction via email, sent by his lawyer. Years in prison for fraud and money laundering. Emily was acquitted, but had to perform community service and was marked by her involvement in the case. David felt a strange relief upon learning that she had not been arrested, but that feeling was soon overtaken by a bitter feeling. Everything could have been different. She could have told him from the beginning, she could have trusted him instead of letting herself be manipulated. That night, David went to the bar where he used to go before he met Emily. He ordered a whiskey and watched the people around him. Couples laughed, friends talked, and he felt out of place. It was then that he noticed a woman sitting alone at the counter, absently fiddling with her glass of wine. She seemed lost in thought, just like him. David hesitated before approaching, but something propelled him. As he sat down next to her, he noticed there was a weariness in her eyes that he recognized. The conversation started lightly, talking about trivialities, but soon got deeper. She was also coming out of a messy divorce, and there was something about her honesty that made him feel comfortable. For the first time in months, David felt like he could start over. He didn't know if it would become something serious, but, for the first time, he allowed himself to think about that possibility. Meanwhile, Emily tried to rebuild her life. She moved into a small apartment and began working as a volunteer at a shelter for women in difficult situations. It was part of his sentence, but over time it became more than that. Seeing these women fighting to get back on their feet made Emily reflect on her own choices. She realized that for years, she had allowed herself to be defined by the mistakes and expectations of others. Now, for the first time, he was trying to find himself. But the nights were the hardest. Emily still thought about David, about the conversations, the trips, the plans they made together. She remembered the look on his face when they last met, a mixture of pain and love that she knew she would never forget. I thought about writing to him, but I knew there was no more room for her in his life. I needed to accept this. Time passed, and Emily began to regain part of herself. He made new friends, went back to school and found a steady job. She still felt the weight of her mistakes, but decided that she would not be defined by them. He learned to live with guilt and use it as fuel to continue growing. David, on the other hand, started going out more, meeting new people and allowing himself new experiences. He knew the past still haunted him, but he was determined not to let it stop him from moving forward. The woman he met at the bar became a close friend, and, little by little, that friendship turned into something more. It wasn't quick, but it was real. One day, while walking through the park, David saw Emily in the distance. She was sitting on a bench, talking to an older woman who seemed to be asking for advice. He stood still for a few minutes, watching. She looked different. Stronger. More sure of yourself. For a moment, he thought about getting closer, but decided not to. He turned and continued walking, feeling a mixture of sadness and peace. Emily saw it too. She didn't know if she should call him, but in the end she decided to let him go. She knew they were both on different paths now. Maybe they always loved each other in some way, but they also knew that love alone was not enough to erase the past. David moved on, but he would always remember Emily as the woman who taught him about love, forgiveness, and the limits of what you can bear. And Emily continued her journey, determined to become a better version of herself. Both followed different roads, but they carried the scars of that story forever. Now we want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Leave your comment and share your opinion. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. We reinforce that this channel does not support any type of betrayal. Our stories show how infidelity can destroy lives and relationships. Until next time.